Welcome back to Power Play. Well, a federal advisor has warned Canada that we could be in for a mammoth trade war with the United States, all because of the environment. Bob Page, who's the chair of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, says that environmental laws that are being brought into the United States have to be mirrored here in this country almost exactly, otherwise we are going to be punished severely. To take a look at this from the American perspective, I'm joined by Chris Sands at the Hudson Institute. He joins us from Washington. Chris, you've read this report and you've seen the reports of the report. It seems to be saying, in effect, that when it comes to environmental policy, there is not going to be a North American designed policy. There will be an American policy designed in Washington, and Canada better get on board with that. Is that essentially right from your view?
Well, I think we've seen something like that before with some of the security policies after 9/11, where the Americans spent so long trying to figure out what we wanted to do here, and Canada was obliged to more or less adopt the standard as the smaller partner in the relationship. At the same time, I think that there'll be a temptation in Canada to compete on a low carbon tax strategy. If you look at the way the Mexicans compete in the United States with a low labor cost strategy, Canada could be the place that decides to tax carbon in a more rational way. So the Americans put this burden on themselves, and people find Canada to be the congenial place to operate. There's no reason that Canada has to adopt exactly the same strategy. But what I think Bob Page and the National Roundtable on Energy and Environment is saying is that if Canada does go that low carbon strategy route, there'll be accusations in Washington that Canada's got an unfair trade advantage, much as we say about Mexican labor, and then there will be a trade war potentially down the road.
Chris, I can see, though, from a Canadian perspective on this, they're saying that the standards, and if it is a national cap and trade program, and we're into that sort of marketing of carbon, Canada might say, well, okay, we can do that, but all the standards and all of the protocols are going to be decided by the Americans in Washington, and Canada won't have any say on that at all. And when you take a look at how those laws are eventually brought forward in Congress, it would seem to make some sense.
Well, I think it's very hard for Canada to have an influence on something like this. It's essentially a domestic American policy debate that affects Canada, not directly but indirectly, and so Canada needs to look for ways that it can influence the debate. One way to do that is through companies that operate on both sides of the border and have a legitimacy participating along the way. Another way to do it, which the Roundtable and others may choose to follow, is to develop some studies to argue for, say, a particular way of measuring carbon or a way of setting up the market in carbon credits. But for example, let's say that the United States decides to value a carbon credit on a life cycle, say from beginning to end, and it decides the carbon credit unit is going to be X. There's no reason Canada couldn't just choose, just as you maintain metrics and we maintain the old English system, to have a different measurement domestically, but you'd have to do a conversion at the border so the credits are convertible. Otherwise, it's not it won't be as much value to Canadian companies or American companies who get those credits. So there are adjustments that you'd certainly have to make, but they're not necessarily onerous. I would think you could probably manage it.
Chris, when you take a look at probably what's coming in this area, as you've described it, it would seem that among the hardest hit industries are going to be Alberta's oil sands.
Yeah. I think that's probably true, but remember that I think the bigger problem is that we are embarking on a heavy tax strategy to try to discourage the use of carbon at a time when the global economy, but in particular the U.S. economy, is in serious decline. Now, I think it was mentioned in your earlier roundtable, the idea of having a heavy tax burden thrown on people at exactly the time that the economy is suffering doesn't seem like good economics, and it really isn't. It's not designed to be part of the recovery, but part of the long-term shift in the U.S. economy. It's likely to be very painful in the United States. It's going to leave a lot of people looking for how they can shift their operations abroad. It'll put a lot of companies out of business. It will dampen American consumption across the board, all of which will be very negative for Canada. I wouldn't bet that the carbon cap and trade systems that we're talking about now are necessarily going to be a long-term strategy. It may be a very expensive one. It may put the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage for a long time. Canada may choose to move in its own direction and stay competitive. It's not the smartest thing we've ever done this side of the border. Even though the problems of climate change are worth dealing with, this is a sort of a strategy the Europeans have tried, and it hasn't worked that well for them ultimately.
Chris Sands of the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today, Chris. Appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Our play continues right after we take this break.